Apple's expected to report its biggest revenue jump in 2 years when it releases its latest quarterly earnings after the bell Thursday. Expect a lot of conversation about Apple Intelligence, the company's AI offering. But it's the gangbuster iPhone 16 sales that are pushing revenues higher. In the 3 weeks following the 16's release, sales in China were 20% higher than sales for the 15 a year earlier, and customers are increasingly trading up to the more expensive models. The iPhone is now in second place in the smartphone market share in China after falling to third earlier this year, according to IDC. Apple may be depending on China to juice sales, but it's reportedly trying to reduce reliance on the nation when it comes to manufacturing. Apple exported $6 billion worth of Indian-made iPhones from March to September, according to Bloomberg. That's an increase of around 33% from the year earlier. Joining me now to discuss is Doug Guthrie, a China scholar at Arizona State University who worked for Apple, advising executives on China from 2014 to 2019. Doug, it's an area that Apple's been struggling of late. So what's behind the increased sales of iPhones in China?
This is never just about what the consumer market wants, but it's usually also about what is the government promoting, and whether that's subtly or very explicitly. And, there are a lot of interesting things going on with U.S.-China relations right now, but also U.S.-China and technology relations. And so, we've seen Intel get dinged by China and then invest $300 million in Chengdu. And we've seen a number of other things happen that really sort of signal those kinds of pressures. And my guess is that really what's happening right now is that, Apple's in China for the long run. Like, Apple is married to China. And I've said this many times to you guys, and I've said this many times in print, but, Apple doesn't just work with Foxconn and can then exit to Foxconn and Chennai. Apple works with 1,600 factories in China, and they're very much deeply embedded, not just to get access to the excellent production that the Chinese factories do, but also in terms of really embedding what we call tacit knowledge into those Chinese factories. And, when I was at Apple, we did a deal many years ago that really got the government to think that we're not just spending labor, but we're actually getting acknowledgement for all of the tacit knowledge that our operations managers are passing on to Chinese officials or to Chinese firms. And so, that ended up being key to the deal that was done, that got us more access to Chinese firms than we ever thought we would. But my guess is that Apple is continuing to push that line. I'm not an insider there anymore, but it's very clear that Tim Cook and the executive team really continue to be committed to the idea that Apple's married to China, and they are continuing to push the idea that we're here and we're continuing to train the operations managers and the tasks. And so then when we get to the question of consumer behavior, we always think, well, people are just buying the best product for the cheapest value that they can get it. That's not how it works in China. People buy what products are promoted by the government. And so my guess is that this is a signal that Apple's doing things right, and in good space with the government right now.
Yeah, we saw the government kind of thwart, I guess, that consumer behavior toward Apple when it was saying, oh, people can't bring these iPhones into work anymore. And we had, kind of a wall, if you will, go up, and that really hurt Apple. So is it your interpretation that has kind of eased that tension?
Yes. And, I remember that day very well. It was about a year ago. I think it was September 23, 2023. And, the Chinese government suddenly said, we're not going to allow Chinese government officials or anybody who works for the government to use iPhones. And my sense during that time was not that they were calling Apple out as much as they were sort of providing a test case for international markets. Because I don't know if you remember, Simone, but what happened on that day was Apple shares dropped 200 billion.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we saw a huge plunge. And so I think it was just like a little flexing of muscle for China to be saying, like, you guys are married to us. And if we, this is a small thing, because not that many Chinese officials actually use iPhones. So I was fascinated at that moment when that happened. But I think it was sort of a test case, just flexing muscles, and the Chinese government saying, like, here's what we can do, guys. What do you think of this? And my guess is that, I remember a couple months later when, Apple was called out by the Department of Justice in the United States, and, there was, some issues going on there. Where was Tim Cook? he was on a plane to Shanghai, and he was, going to Shenzhen to, celebrate the opening of the R&D centers. So
Hmm.
I think it's very clear, like, okay, guys, we're here with
Yeah.
you, we're here. And so my guess is that I'm not an insider on this anymore, but my guess is that relationship is continuing to evolve, and I think right now the government is sort of rewarding Apple, saying like, okay, so you guys are partners with China, we're here, and you're delivering tacit knowledge for us, and like, let's just keep going.
Yeah. At the same time, we are seeing Apple move or pick up manufacturing outside of China. We're seeing a lot of activity happening in India. I mentioned it before we brought you in. Uh, how is Apple able to do this, and how does it affect that relationship?
Well, the India question is really interesting. So India is just the first and most important piece of this. Back when I was with Apple from 2014 to 2019, there was a lot of effort to develop and just sort of show that we could develop relationships in places like Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is not really a competitor of Apple because Vietnam is a country of 95 million people and probably in the sort of what we would view as the parallel to the floating population, that's the migrant labor force in China, which is 350 million people. Probably in Vietnam, there's maximum of 15
Mm.
million. And so it's just not a competitor. But India is, right? India is a country that is equal in size in terms of its population and has equal numbers of, the size of migrant labor population and poor people. And so India is a real interesting threat. And so when Foxconn built a plant in Chennai and suddenly iPhones could be assembled in Chennai, I think it was, again, a signal to the market like, hey, yes, we're married to China, but we have other options. Now, just to be very clear, part of the reason that Apple's the most profitable company in the world is because it works with 1,600 suppliers in China, not just Foxconn. And so, it would take 30 years to build the manufacturing supply chain in India that exists in China. And the Chinese government knows this. But I think when we were viewing this and when Foxconn was building a plant in Chennai, there was an argument to the Chinese government like, okay, like we want to be partners, let's be partners. But if we're not, let's continue, we'll continue to develop this and maybe we'll be out of here in a couple of decades. Now, the interesting thing that's going on with China and India right now is the resolution of the border dispute. This is, to me, Simone, a big deal because Xi Jinping really wants to position himself as the leader of the BRICS nations. And so, the idea that like, okay, we have a border dispute with India and we're in competition with India over, where Apple is producing its products and whether or not the manufacturing supply. But it may be the case that there is a big play here that is about collaboration and coordination. And it may be the case that the resolution of this border dispute just within the last couple of days, I think signals that maybe, this is a moment where there's a big pivot away from the West and Xi Jinping and Modi and others thinking like, okay, you guys can do your G7 thing over there and we can be at the kids' table at the G20, but like BRICS is bigger than you thought. And so I think it's a really interesting time to watch this because my guess is what we're going to see is more collaboration and coordination between China and India.
And with that in mind, does Apple, more publicly moving into India and trying to diversify away from China, does that become less important in the eyes of the Chinese government if they're going to cozy up closer to India? Do they see that as a win for the region?
Yes, my guess is that the answer is that it becomes a win for the region. So rather, again, I'm not sitting next to Xi Jinping, so I don't know exactly what he thinks, but I know some of the people who are advising him, and they're thinking very strategically about the region. And so my guess is what they're thinking is like, okay, we could have this competitive thing in which we're always threatened by the idea that, Foxconn and Apple are going to go produce in India, or we could be coordinating the region so that the BRICS nations are the most powerful group of nations in the world. And so therefore we need to collaborate and coordinate. And so my guess is what we're going to see. So Foxconn, Taiwanese company, building a plant in Chennai, we're probably going to see a lot of Chinese companies. So Foxconn is here and their final assembly plant, Taiwanese. Pegatron, a Chinese company, final assembly, they do the same thing with Foxconn. My guess is that Pegatron and a lot of the other components companies are going to start building factories in India. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to see how the coordination and collaboration goes on here.
It's a whole new future. Doug Guthrie, thank you so much always for your comments.
So amazing to be here with you guys. You guys do amazing work, and I'm so thankful.